So welcome to Talks at Google in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today, very pleased to have here Andreas Weigend speaking on data for the people, a topic that's very close to us, very familiar to us, of course. And very broadly speaking, there's a couple ways to go with this topic. Obviously, we are very generous with our data, both explicitly and just in the normal course of living in the modern world. And we get back a lot for that, and some people might argue that we don't get back enough or whatever. And so one way to go is kind of the negative direction of controlling it, privacy, micropayments, all that sort of thing. The other direction is to be much more open and positive, to embrace this, and then see we can maximize the benefit we get from data. I think the latter is broadly Andreas' approach, but of course, there are dangers. There are things we can do to make this work as well as possible for us as individuals, and that'll be the topic for today, something that Andreas has a lot of experience with. But rather than doing a conventional introduction, I think we'll make this a little bit more interactive and dynamic, like this talk in general. So please, Andreas, welcome to Google.
And welcome to the social data revolution. Because ultimately, not only is this the title of my YouTube channel, but ultimately, really, that is the amazing world we live in.
So reading the book, you started life actually as a physicist. And so how did you come to be what you are today?
So I got my PhD in physics at Stanford, and I've always been a data person. I was at CERN as an undergraduate. It was really amazing to be logged in to other computers. I mean, that was way before the web was invented. And then I went to my PhD advisor, my initial PhD advisor at SLAC, the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, and told him, Jonathan, I really thought about it, and I'm more interested in neural networks than in particle physics. So he said, okay, what is that? And he thought, poking electrodes into monkeys or something. No, it's about learning from data. And that, he could live with. And he was super generous to then actually still support me for a while, and did my PhD with Dave Rumelhart, who some people, really think was the one who pushed the idea of neural networks. And that's what I did my PhD in. So machine learning, as we would call it now, lots of people in the world know about it now. Those days, it was just a few of us. Jan LeCun, who does Facebook's neural network stuff now, was one of my friends. So it was a very smooth transition. The transition from doing physics, which I still love, and I always say once a physicist, always a physicist. If you think like a physicist, then you have actually a couple of attributes. One is you don't run away from data, but you run towards data. So sometimes when I talk to people from the intelligence community, they would tell me that I would be a terrible agent, because when I see something sketchy, I always want to see what's happening there. Like sketchy data, for instance, where you need to interpret the data and fill in some meaning. Second thing physicists do is that they're pretty good in what I call data literacy. So for me, data literacy is that order of magnitude calculations. What can be the case and what can't be the case. As opposed to, my brother's also a physicist, and he says when he has computer science grad students, they always come and say, oh, the algorithm is already converging on the least significant digit. So physicists, they know about numbers, they love data, and the most important thing is, I think, they love experiments. So at some stage, 2001, 2002, a phone rang and a headhunter was on the line, and he said that Jeff Bezos would like to have a chief scientist. And I tried to figure out why. I'd never worked in a real company, and why would I want to leave university, work at a company? And so it turns out that Jeff, of course, knew from previously being at D. Shaw how important data is, but what he can do in retail, of course, as opposed to in finance, where it can be expensive, is experiments. So just like Google, when I was at Amazon, and of course afterwards, have done tens of thousands of experiments. And you probably all know many stories, and maybe I leave some for the Q&A if we still have time. I also wanted to be a bit more interactive than that. So then after Amazon, I went back to teaching. I love teaching. And I have to say, I teach one course a year at UC Berkeley called Social Data Revolution. And it is just amazing to have the opportunity to basically have the university as a platform where once a week, for 10 weeks or so, very smart students sit there and they actually listen to you and they debug your thoughts. And then you see when it's really painful for them, if you don't know how to do something on Facebook then they just help you out and they explain it to you. So I think it's a great deal. It's a wonderful way to spend your life. And then, however, it doesn't scale. So scaling is important, and that's when I got the idea to actually write the book, about 3 years ago, a little bit more than 3 years ago. And the book I then wanted to write has been compressed into the chapter 7, which is my favorite chapter in this book, which has all of the examples and the different verticals which I look at. Unfortunately, when I talked to my editor, I said, you need to prepare them for this. You can't expect every reader to, be at Google or at Amazon or at Facebook. So we had these sort of 6 chapters leading up to it. One of them is on data literacy, as I just mentioned. So actually, this book, Data for the People, is really meant for the people. And I don't only teach at Berkeley. I also teach in China. And I'm not sure how dubious an honor it was that People's Daily had a long interview with me published on the front page about data for the people. I don't read Chinese. I don't know what it really says. I can only fear the worst. But, People's Daily and data for the people sounds on the surface structure at least kind of similar. So why did I write the book? I wrote the book because I realized when I was at Amazon, and each and every one of you, I'm sure, has the same realization here at Google, that the refineries, as I call them, the data refineries, like Google, that they, without even trying hard, know so much about us as individuals, that I think it is a wrong battle to fight. The wrong battle is to try to plug the holes. And maybe being at Google here, a good story for this is Google Maps from the early days, where I was told from somebody involved in that meeting that somebody hacked Google Maps. And immediately the idea came, well, rather than plugging that hole, how can we make bug to feature? How can we make it possible for people to actually amend data? So that thinking that you don't try to really stop the unstoppable, but you see what can we create of it. That is the underlying thought which I very much embraced, and I hope that the readers of the book will also get a feeling about why I think embracing the data and being empowered by the data is what I think our better choice is, rather than romanticizing the view of how good it was when we could have control of our data and taking back all these metaphors, taking back control. I mean, we never had control of our data. So we can't possibly have control. Imagine a week without Google. You could stay home, you wouldn't have to come into work, but boy, how would you get stuff done? I mean, what would stuff be? So for me, when I say social data revolution, that really is a revolution which has affected billions of people's lives. No question. We, of course, think about information differently, Google. We think about stuff we buy differently, Amazon. I mean, who of you would not look at a review before they choose a certain item? By the way, if anybody wants to review the book, Amazon is open now for reviews, and I think it's a very important ingredient. Thirdly, if you think about who you are, let's potentially take Google Plus or maybe Facebook, or if you're in China, WeChat, that has changed the way 1 billion people think about who they are, I would argue. So the general framework is, how can we work together, the refineries and the individuals, to figure out what can we create for the individual. So Google, of course, has the long-term view that if you have the choice between making a quick buck now or having a consumer in the long term, you of course go for the long term. So in some way, I'm preaching to the choir here. But I still want to go back to the question, and I think it's a question worth asking people. What would you do if you didn't have access to Google for a day? And then people realize just how much would break. And I wouldn't even find, I'm staying with a friend of mine who worked for me at Amazon, I wouldn't even find the place without Google Maps. And then I always try to really get out to people that necessity, that it is, I need to tell Google where I want to go. Otherwise, Google cannot tell me turn left at the next intersection. So I really, part of data literacy, hope that we can upgrade the conversation from people. That those logical things that, in the restaurant, I pay after I eat, or whatever better examples you might have, that those also apply to data. And if you go into a cab, I'm not sure whether any of you are straighted, and the cabbie asks you, well, where can I take you? And said, oh, I'm not telling you. That would be invading my privacy. That is not going very far. Now, what I think my first of the 6 rights I want to talk about is it is the right to access your data. Now, I see all of you nodding, and former President Obama also said this. The right to access your data is an important right. It is not as trivial as it sounds, because it clearly isn't just access to the bits and the bytes. So I was in Shanghai, actually when these people from People's Daily was at my place interviewing me, and I showed them location history on Google. So I showed them, you go into history and location, and I had them pick a date, and they said, wow, that is so amazing. That was just something beyond they could believe, that a company actually is giving back or is returning to the user in exchange to, showing me more relevant geolocation ads. And I'm, by the way, personally, I used to show Google Latitude on my webpage, on Weigend.com. And yes, indeed, there were situations. I remember in one dinner where I was, traffic is sometimes terrible in the Bay Area, pretty late, and I told the other party saying, I'll be in there in 5 minutes. And he said, you won't. I know you are still on 101. So that right to access your data is, I think, a very important one. Building tools that allow people to get meaning out of the access of their data is where I think the most important part comes from. Just raw, here is all the data, a la Facebook, doesn't help anything. Building an awesome tool like the Google location history, search history. I think that's about, for me at least, the last thing I would be willing to share, my search history. And honestly, I don't think anybody who thinks about it would think differently. You can have all my text messages and have all my email, but my searches, but you have them already. So, building tools that help people understand their data, since this is an educated crowd here. One of my favorite sayings is to make the implicit explicit. There are 2 meanings to it. One is, in all the data which I look at, and all the searches I do, making implicit patterns, showing them to me. I think that at least is fun and might actually help me also make some decisions, like the hours of the day when I search, or the days of the week, things like that. The topics are always very hard to classify, but making implicit patterns explicit is part of giving somebody access to their data. The second part, or the second interpretation of making the implicit explicit, is that as a company, you write down a function. For instance, search relevance, where you figure out what are the ways to evaluate whether if we do this kind of algorithm or that kind of algorithm, or this parameter tweak versus that parameter tweak, which one actually do we believe is better in the long term. So into this, what I call equation of business, you bake in an incredible amount of assumptions, but you make them explicit. At Amazon, I spent probably 50 hours with Jeff Bezos for each group to figure out what is the, we call it fitness function, that they should be evaluated by. And it has to have a buy-in. And there always are mistakes. You always forget something. And then, of course, smart people go and optimize for that. And they say, oh, yes, right. But that, of course, we didn't mean. So, for example, if someone says, we want to increase conversion rates, so you turn, after the first sale of the year, you turn your servers off, no more sales, but 100% conversion rate. So, it's a constant process, and making it explicit is something which I think is super useful for the company. And it really condenses the thinking, and reasonable people absolutely can disagree on things. But then once you have it, and then you crank the handle whether this experiment or that experiment is better. So the first right is the right to access your data. Let me throw another wrench into it. Your data. So let's say Facebook. So today, I am on NPR, Marketplace Tech, and there are lots of comments. Now, if I change the post I have in my Facebook, Weigend, if I change the post somewhat, if I change it a lot, then suddenly, some of the comments people make don't make sense anymore. I might be learning from some of the comments. I might incorporate into my Facebook post. Now, they look really stupid. So whose data is this? So our ownership concept that, works for apples or even for physical books here, that ownership concept clearly breaks down for data. So I don't have a solution which I say you must do it this way, but I do see a couple of directions how people should think about it differently. And it clearly, you might have heard the example last year, which I think is a beautiful one, of that monkey that took a picture of himself, that selfie. And then the photographer sued Wikimedia or whoever published the picture because they said, it was not taken by a human. So these are just very interesting topics which I love for us as society to discuss. And the ownership of data, for me, an image is data, is one of the examples where I really feel let's actually not run away from it. And please, let's not run away and say, oh, the lawyers 100 years ago, they wrote down how to treat it. They had no freaking idea of what we have now. It's a good starting point, but let's work together and actually make it better. Access to my data. I have one more story. It's not in the book. There is a German paper which is called Bild Zeitung, and it's the largest paper in the Western Hemisphere in terms of daily publication. Not particularly intellectual, shall we say. And the head, the editor-in-chief, came to class in Berkeley, and we had dinner, and somebody took a picture and posted it on Facebook. I was barely starting on the Bay Bridge when my phone rang. And the Taz, a more left-wing paper, called me up and said, we saw a picture, we need to do an interview. I said, absolutely. And what happened was then they said, we just have one question. Who has the most power over you as a consumer? Apple? Amazon? Facebook? Google? What do you think? Anybody would not say Google? Raise your hand. Oh yeah, who do you think? Your friends. We talked about companies, okay? I don't know whether Google has more power over me than my friends because, let's say Google wants to let me disappear, remove me from the index. Yeah, we knew this guy, Andreas, there's not even any trace left of him, not a problem. And actually, you all are familiar with the right to be forgotten, the delinking, which, by the way, in terms of raw numbers, is nothing compared to copyright things Google has to deal with by companies complaining that something was used illegally. I want not a right to be forgotten. I want a right to be remembered. So for me, the right to access for data means also the right to be remembered. Some service level agreement that, hey, and Google is doing a very good job on that, I want my old emails to not sort of randomly disappear. Big difference to China. So I gave a talk at a company in December, and I wanted to pull up on WeChat, which is sort of Tencent's version of Facebook. It's a communication tool. I wanted to pull up on WeChat a picture somebody else had posted with me and Jack Ma maybe 2 weeks prior. Not thinking anything, and says, this picture is no longer available. It might have been removed by the whatever the person who posted. Of course, all in Chinese, they don't know what it means to ask, what does it mean? And I felt really violated that there's something which I do to get them good traffic, and then 2 weeks later, I get this nebulous message, but this picture is no longer available. Now, of course, it's a question. 100 years, probably I have no problem with that. 2 weeks, I do have a problem with that. So I really brought that up in that crowd. I was quite annoyed. I mean, it sort of happens in real time. I want to show them something is no longer there. Really pushing. What company would you want to have taken care of your data? A company that really has very good service level agreements and uptime versus a company which randomly deletes stuff and then they say, oh, it's too expensive to have a server. I mean, that's just ridiculous. This cost of storage is not what difference it should make for anybody. How much can you produce? It's $100 a year at very most. And the Chinese said, oh, we would prefer that second company. And that is what really brought these cultural biases very much up to the forefront of my thinking. I'm familiar with Europe. I gave you the example, rightly be forgotten versus what we think here. But the attitude towards your data and that they embrace an ephemeral nature. Whereas I grew up in a world where, like in physics, these things are there and you can attach them, you can access them. So sometimes our biases might just be representing us well. And other people in the world think about it differently. And 2 nights ago, I had dinner with Danny Kahneman, and I asked him, why do you think that's the case? And he thought maybe it is that the attitude towards accountability is different in the US compared to China, that they're very happy to blame it on the computer, which is not an excuse probably any of us would accept if somebody says, at check-in, oh, I'm sorry, the computer made a mistake. No, it's not the computer which made a mistake. Somebody made a mistake, not the computer. The other point I want to make, and that's the last one on this right here, to access your data, is in the comparison between China and the US, this huge experiment of running Facebook for 1 billion people and running WeChat for 1 billion people. And I don't know who of you has been on WeChat. Oh, too few people. In that case, let me just say very generally that the assumption, for instance, that if you are friends, you usually can see the friends we have in common, which seems like a perfectly good thing for me. That after all, if we have friends in common, if we have mutual friends, then why would I hide my mutual friends from you? I think this data symmetry, as Jordan Novet wrote it in a wonderful article a few years ago, this data symmetry is the way I think fairness is built. No way WeChat would ever show you anybody's friends. So it's a bit like my PR agent, that they don't give me his number because I might disintermediate them. Not thinking that when we meet, I could actually ask you for your number. So they might as well make it frictionless and make it easier and see for some potential disconnects of saying, hey, be introduced and you take it from here. So that wrong notion about having power by withholding data. It's the notion how the world used to work. Companies got big by erecting barriers to information. That's how money used to be made. Like used car dealers, as an example. Now, if you think about the companies we know and love, they got big by removing barriers to information. And I just love, as a physicist, I love when the sign flips. Another sign flip example in this world is when I was an undergrad in Germany, we were not allowed to unplug our phones. So the role of the government was to protect the network from the consumer. And luckily, at least under the previous administration, there have been moves to actually protect the consumer from the network. So sign flips is something I'd love to talk about more. I have a few examples in the book. I think it's just very interesting when something doesn't change by 10%, but changes the sign from plus to minus of a minus to plus. 5 more rights to go. The second right is the right to inspect the refineries. So when you buy a car or fridge or whatever, typically there are some things like stickers on it that help you make a decision. For instance, the fuel efficiency or how loud the fridge is. These are numbers which EPA or other groups agree on how to measure it. So it's not just one person just puts in their ear and says, oh, that fridge is loud. That would be the current administration's attitude to this. But no, they had scientists and they actually figure out without being gagged how they can actually come up with those numbers so you as a consumer can compare them. I want the same for refineries, for data refineries. Of course, not fuel efficiency, but how secure is my data? So there's no question when people naively come and say, oh, I would not put the data up in the cloud. Actually, it was in Shanghai when I heard that argument. What? You are using Google Docs here from China? What if Google can see what you're writing? They see it anyways. Besides, there's the Chinese government. So don't fool yourself. Don't live the illusion that they don't know. But we have extremely strong economic constructs that companies do not want to be broken into. Because as you saw in Sony's example, for instance, it can be very expensive. And if there ever was a security issue which affected consumers at, let's say, one of the top companies, let's say Google versus Amazon, that really would, I think, be an extraordinarily terrible thing for the company if suddenly it seems that your data are not safe anymore. It's absolute alignment of interest of the consumer and the company against the hackers and the criminals. For my birthday last year, I was in Moscow, November 10, and I met with Putin. And I spent the day with the head of Sberbank, which is the largest bank there, which he owns a certain part of. And the head of that bank, Hermann Greff, very smart individual. He was called out halfway through, and he came back and said, what happened? Well, we had an attack on our servers. And I was thinking, if anyone attacks, it would be the Russians, or maybe the Chinese. So I asked him, so where did it come from? Of course from the United States. I mean, where else would it be coming from? That makes you think, we do have a certain worldview here. It makes sense once you start thinking about it. So part of this right to inspect the refineries means that you can look in what is being done. Do you use two-factor authentication for email? None of these things really apply to Google, but not all companies are as good as Google. So that is stickers not for your fridge, but stickers for your refinery, allowing users to make decisions of whether they rather have more convenience, like who needs passwords? You can just directly read your email, versus more security. Let people make the trade-off. The remaining 4 rights are the right to amend. That means I believe in democracy. I believe in giving people a voice. I believe in empowering people, and not by controlling how the truth would be or alternate facts should be. So that means let anybody annotate anything. So if you think X about Y, make a link on Y where you are saying X. And then use the $100 billion machinery of relevance ranking, whether it's Google or whether it's Amazon recommendations, Netflix. Use that $100 billion machinery, which you use very well for ads. Use that for amendments. So basically, anybody should be able to say anything, and quickly, things that actually seem to be right or interesting, maybe interesting more than right, they will bubble up, and that is very short, the right to amend. Next one, the second of these action rights, is the right to blur. Blur geolocation is the best example, but it also works for searches or for products you buy. That you should be in charge of the radius or the granularity, the resolution in which data that concern you can be processed. In all cases, it was very, very important to me is that people understand the trade-offs they are making. The world is not black or white. So if you say, I am going to blur my geolocation to 1 kilometer, don't expect the pizza delivery man to bring it to your door. So, hey, if you really want this, then you can't want that, and just live up to it. But don't live that illusion or these logical inconsistencies that you don't want anybody to know where you are, but you would like the pizza to be delivered to your door. And it's just a super trivial example, but this right to blur your data is important for me. The illusion people have is that they can sort of blur data at the source. I don't believe in that. I think the carriers, for instance, Google, of course, knows to the resolution of less than a meter where I'm pretty much 24/7. It, of course, knows what time I'm waking up. It, of course, knows what I'm interested in. All these things, you can't do anything at the source. That's why I think having the right where you are in charge of figuring out how precisely you want the things to be known, that really should be your choice. Now, there are some interesting things from psychology. So, for instance, Werner wanted to figure out 20 years ago, who of you knows what differential privacy is? Okay. It's a very important concept that if I tell you something, so you can, let's say, as a government, for instance, make a better policy decision, I want to be protected that you can't use it against me. So my belief really is data of the people, data by the people, but data for the people. So if, let's say, somebody asks, as we had with the previous president, who took something but he didn't inhale. So did you smoke pot last month? And let's say you're in a state where it's illegal to smoke pot. So if you say, I did, and then the next day the police shows up and says, you said you smoked pot, up to prison. I mean, it's not that bad. But think about other things which would be this way. That would suck, that you try to have some policy to help them understand things. So that guy called Werner had the idea that I'll ask you a question, but don't answer yet. Here's a coin, and you flip the coin. And I don't want to know what you flip. If you get heads, you say yes, irrespective of what you really did. If you get tails, you have to say the truth. That's pretty cool, because more than half of the people say yes, so it's clear to any prosecutor that they can't go after these people. And if you have enough statistics, any of you can do the math about how to figure out the signal, given that 50% of the people only say the truth and the others say yes, irrespectively of what actually happened. So I encourage you to look a bit into these differential privacy ideas, which help us get data for the people, where we set it up in a way that you can't use it against them. Google does it when you're in Chrome, where you are looking what people do, where you try to understand malware on people's computers. It's a similar concept where smart people came up with ways finding out things about the population which cannot be used against the individual. The fifth right is the right, I wanted to call it the right to play. And my editor said that is maybe not serious enough. So we call it the right to experiment. In 1999, I started a company called Mood Logic, a little startup with the purpose of music recommendations. It was an interesting time. I also was the founding meeting of Pandora, and they went different routes. Our little company got bought by All Media, which got bought by another company. So the idea was we want to, first of all, figure out, not from the metadata, but from the usage pattern of how people skip between songs, what we should recommend. And then, and I really haven't seen that elsewhere, we want to make explicit to people the trade-off between exploration and exploitation. So in machine learning, one of the things where you can't just hope the system will come up with a solution is whether you should explore more, meaning try out new things that you don't know whether they're good or bad. Like this one-armed bandit problem in Vegas. If one machine once gave you some money, will you spend the rest of the day on that one machine? Or are you going to still explore some other machines? Might be better or might be worse. Exploration was exploitation. So that is a knob which I think should be handed to the consumer, to the user. Because I know whether I had a stressful day and all I want is some soothing music, or like an airplane, check in like a 3 hours delay, every 10 minutes they update the departure by 10 minutes and you don't sit anywhere. You really just want something which is now quiet. Or am I in the mood to explore new stuff? Let me listen to things I've never listened to before. Chances are I hate it, but chances also are that I discover something new. So that's one example. So when I say the right to play or the right to experiment is think how you can expose to the user some of the knobs where you don't know the answer as well as the user does. So exploration, exploitation is one example. In search, advanced search, you have a few options which are a step in the right direction, but I think there can be more by helping people to actually set the parameters the way they want to set them on their terms at a given point in time. And then we have all the data. We got to look at them, but that's not enough for me. I want to be able to take the data to whoever I please. So I call this the right to port. I want to port my data. And we all know PGP and API calls stuff. So just implement it in a reasonable way that if some other company would offer a better search product, then make it easy for me to actually take my data in a secure way, telling them here's what the data is. And I think it helps the ecosystem because those companies which are good, people will come back. Make it easy for people to actually port their data and try out something else. You can always learn from who's coming back. It's another feedback loop in experiments you're doing. So that's what I wanted to say about those 6 rights which I wrote about in the book. And I've actually only launched the book 2 days ago. I've not really talked about it yet, and I've never really spent as much time except in class on those rights. So I want to end with the couple of things which I do not have answers for.
Great. So questions?
Hi, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
So when you talked about the right to blur in particular, that made me think of one of the current problems is that a lot of us who come from fairly privileged backgrounds think about, oh, this is great, I can just share my information, what could possibly go wrong? But the immense power of doxing has been shown to be a force against people. And what's worse is the farther we go towards the default of sharing all your information, oh, but maybe you will blur your location for safety and can't get pizza, you start to create like a digital underclass, right? You can force people out of this glorious data world for their own safety. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it was at lunch when we talked about that there was a time when, for instance, Harvey Milk was shot. There was a time when, the first gay bar in San Francisco, they didn't have windows, so people couldn't look in. And I think that social norms ultimately is what determines our attitude towards many things. Let me twist it slightly. Hein, who used to be at Google, now runs data for Snapchat. And I'll be there in a couple of weeks. And I think that's quite interesting that on the surface, you have things being ephemeral. Of course, the deep structure is still that the data is there. is that ultimately helping or hurting? And you know the story, which was reported in The Guardian, that at one of these services, it was, I think, secret, not everything was as ephemeral as they claimed it was. See with that. So I don't know. Do you have any suggestion?
Nope, still working on that.
Yeah. Right after my PhD, I wanted to teach in Thailand at the university for half a year. So I went to Chulalongkorn, and two things I learned from that. One is that my friends told me that is scientific suicide if you are, three things. One, first Peter Norvig I knew at the time already. Scientific suicide if you are going to be out of touch for half a year. And it was a different time. So when I came half a year later, back to the US, turned out most people hadn't noticed that I actually was gone. Those days, so underclass, email got delivered to Thailand twice a day by dial-in with one connection to Melbourne from the Asian Institute of Technology in Bangkok to Melbourne and getting the email for the country back and forth. And there was 2 weeks when we didn't have email. And then some dude showed up at my office at Chulalongkorn. I think I had the only Spark station at the university. Showed up with I'm not sure whether you know these cartridges they used to have. So shows up with the cartridges. This is the email for the country for the last 2 weeks. So I had never dealt with SMTP. I mean, we can learn anything. So I first did the obvious thing, which is I grabbed for my name. And like the first 10 things were other people talking about me. At that stage, I said, this is not a problem I'm going to solve. I don't want to know what people are talking about me. Basically, I didn't expect that to be happening. I thought I'd just see where I'm the two line, and I'll just quickly scan through those. And the third thing was that I had hoped that the digital divide would get bridged with, in those days, the internet, then later the web, and I am not sure about it. What I am sure about is that another comparison between the US and China is, of course, the Great Firewall. It clearly makes my life worse every time I go to China. It is, last time, they're like 6 weeks a year. Last time was less happy than ever, because things which used to be easy just become incredibly hard. And even things like using apps in China, like Didi, which is the Uber, the Lyft equivalent, if you don't read Chinese, you're just hosed. Another question?
You talked about the right to annotate, the right to amend.
Yeah.
But what about the truth? Should I not have the right to read fact-based?
Very tricky. I totally agree, and I was sort of halfway mentioned fake news before. I believe, as I said, that the $100 billion engine, which we have figured out for search relevance, that can also figure out the truth, if we want it. Yeah. That's my belief in, if you have enough data sources, if you have the identity of people who post things, if you know that this person thinking about Wikipedia, who gets reverted and stuff like this, I think we can build pretty good models. It will never be perfect, but what is the alternative? So it is not that the alternative is that we have Donald Trump telling us how it really is, but the alternative is that some random stuff will happen. I believe in masses and intelligent machine intelligence of figuring out what actually is a more likely version of the truth than one person dictating it. But that brings me to one of the two hard problems at the end, which is the question of identity. So underlying here is that you have your Gmail account. or you have your Amazon account. So when you write those reviews about my book, did I mention reviews? When you write those reviews, then your identity is there. And actually, when I was at Amazon, we had very good discussions with Jeff Bezos where I was wrong. I believed you should have pseudonyms because I did not want actually, a colleague, if I write a bad review about his book, knowing that that is Andreas, and that would not, really further our relationship all that much. I really believed in pseudonyms, and Jeff says no, we need real names. So Facebook probably gave him that real names. It's an open question. I don't have an answer. I just want to say the question about should one institution hold the identity, what should that institution be? In my last class, I had in Berkeley in November, I had 2 wonderful guest speakers. One former NSA employee and a lawyer for the ACLU. So David Holtzman, he wrote a wonderful book called Privacy Lost 10 years ago. He knows what he's talking about. And Nicole Ozer, wonderful person who went to Berkeley Law, who really also knows what she knows. And she busted a few operations where, Facebook, for instance, handed over via some third-party company data to the law enforcement so they could, use their sparse resources better, So we had that conversation, and it culminated in the question which I asked. So it's my YouTube channel, youtube.com/social data revolution, and I repeated it in Moscow for Putin in front of that audience. Who do you think will be around longer? The United States of America or Google? Almost all the students believed Google. But then in the bigger picture, to come to my last point, good old Plato, 2,000 years ago, he talked about that allegory of the cave. And the idea was that people, in his case prisoners, I don't like that metaphor much, but prisoners for him were sitting, they couldn't move their heads for their entire lives, and they were only looking at the wall of a cave. And that wall had shadows, as we would call them, had dark things projected. There was a light source behind them, daylight or something. They didn't have that concept because all they saw were these shadows on the wall. And those shadows were puppets, maybe somebody's carrying around, or maybe were people behind them they didn't know. And there were certain laws which they figured out. For instance, natura non facit saltus, as the Romans would have said later, which means nature doesn't jump around. So there was continuity in those shadows. And they had their worldview. They had their stories about that. They couldn't turn their heads, and then one of the prisoners was set free. So he left, and whoa, there was all that light out there. And it hurt him. He went back and said, that's it, no, not doing that again. So the world we live in is the world according to Google. The world we live in the West is the world according to Facebook. So all I can say is use that responsibility wisely. Thank you.